Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, you have my next episode of Recent Reads. I am starting off with two books. Both of them are nonfiction. I was looking for my page where I had everything written down for my classes for Aurelium, for Magical Readathon, and I don't know where I put it. But I'm fairly certain that the first one I'm going to talk about was not for a particular class. I need to find that because several of the books that I talked about in last week's video kind of for classes, I just forgot to mention which classes. Alright, so the first one I'm going to talk about is Peace Not Apartheid by Jimmy Carter. This is one of the books that stayed in my own TBR from the really good, really cheap, really big book sale. I always forget the order of that. It was written or published in 2006, so it is pretty dated. But I think that gave it a unique perspective on the situation. A time capsule sort of perspective. And this book, it's a little bit history, but a little bit memoir as well. Because Jimmy Carter, he both narrates it, he writes it, he narrates it. I listen to it as an audiobook. And he shares a lot of his personal experiences in it as well as some other information that he has learned. And he has it roughly split up into different time frames, like before he became president, when he was president, the Reagan years, H.W. Bush years, Clinton years, etc. And all of those, he is on a different level. He is now a diplomat. He has a different perspective on the situation than a lot of other people have because of his role as president and on the international stage. And I thought that lent this book a unique perspective that I got that wasn't just sharing information. So there's two other things that Jimmy Carter brings to this story, and one is his Christian faith. It's deeply held, it's very important to him, and he talks early on in the book about how he is squaring the circle, basically, of what he holds as very valuable, seeing these places that were in the Bible, with what political modern Israel is doing to the Palestinians, also with what is talked about in the Bible about how you treat people. So I thought that was a really cool, really neat perspective to see. And additionally, he strikes me as a very positive person, a very hopeful person, because he keeps going with a lot of stuff. He doesn't strike me as the person who's going to give up just because something failed this time, then that time, then the time after. Some people look at him as a hopeless optimist, but I could tell with various things that he said throughout this book that he still has that layer of hope. And it was also interesting to look at this 18 years later and look at the situation that is currently going on. And some of that hope, it's like, was he deluded in that hope because these things haven't played out? But it was definitely a unique window on the situation. Then the next book that I read, it was a short read. It is a book that I had for an ARC that I didn't have an electronic copy of, so I thought I wouldn't be able to give feedback. And part of me thought that I had one, and so when I saw this for sale on Book Outlet, I think for fairly cheap, I went ahead and got it, and I'm so glad that I did. This is an excellent book. So when you learn about the overview of American history, when you're talking about the early 1900s, the early 20th century, and the idea, the World War I, anti-anarchism, how that started to play out, the American Communist Party, etc., you often hear about Sacco and Vanzetti and their unjust trial. But I knew nothing really about the details of their trial. And this book, very short as you can see, it is a young adult nonfiction. It doesn't dumb down anything. I love the layout of it. It does do away with footnotes. Like, there aren't footnotes. There are some endnotes. I think that's more manageable. And also, they don't have a separate picture section. They insert it into the text, which it makes it more manageable for high schoolers to read. Like, you give them a 2-page article and they're like, this is so much to read. Sorry, teacher and me coming out. I love the way that this is set up. I also learned so much about their story. This was fascinating and absolutely heartbreaking. This is definitely a book that I'm going to keep in my classroom library. I might use it in future lessons if I'm able to work it in. It's that solid of a book. This is very, very well done. Okay, I know it must seem like I always wear this, and I do wear it a lot. It's just so comfortable. It does get washed. Anyway, let's get to updating some books. I have 2 books to update about now. I have finished 2 books as of this morning, but I haven't written my reviews for them yet, so I'm gonna hold off on reviewing them now. The first book that I'm gonna talk about is one that I read for Aurelium. I remember the prompt was circle on the cover, but I don't remember the class. I haven't entered any of these books on the tracker or whatever, but I need to do that. That book is Show Me a Sign by Anne-Marie Lizotte. I think it's, yeah, no, Anne-Claire Lizotte. Sorry about that. So this book I knew was going to be powerful. It is an award winner. Obviously, that's the circle that I chose. And it opens up an area of history that I know little about, or knew little about. As I said when talking about this book here, I love when books do that. Now, that previous one was nonfiction. This is fiction, but it is based on a real thing. So the setup for this, it's set on Martha's Vineyard early on in the early national era of the United States. And Martha's Vineyard's an island, and the community there was a large number of deaf people who lived there. It seemed unusually large to a lot of people on the outside looking in, but it felt fairly normal to the people who lived there. Because there were so many deaf people that lived in this community, it became standard for people to both speak and sign. Like people who were hearing, they also knew sign language. They were bilingual because sign language is a completely separate language. And it just was normal. And they didn't face the same stigmas of ableism that you would face in the outside world. And the main character here, Mary Lambert, she's deaf. Her father's also deaf. Her mother's hearing, and her brother was hearing as well. That's one of these tragic things that is set up just prior to the start of the story. Her brother has died. Another thing that lends seriousness and weight to this narrative is the fact that it is told from a perspective of own voices, not from having lived in that time period, but having lived as a deaf person. The author herself is deaf, and it was interesting because I did choose to read it as an audiobook. And there is an author's note that I think is just in the audiobook version that talks about the choice to listen to it as an audiobook and how the author appreciates that that is available for people who have vision issues or other things like that. So I did appreciate that. Now, in this book, the main character, Mary, is dealing with feeling a lot of guilt for the death of her brother, which happened fairly recently prior to the start of this story. And then also, there is a guy who's introduced to the pastor on the island, and he's an amateur scientist, which was very typical of the 1800s. He is despicable. He's ugly. Like, his attitudes are just ugly towards these people. When he is interviewing certain people, like when he's at Mary Lambert's home, he speaks to her mother and only her mother. Completely ignores that her father's there, that she's there. It's like they don't count. And obviously there is a huge stigma, and there was a huge stigma against deaf people, thinking that they're unintelligent, that they're feeble-minded, that because their voice sounds the way it does, because they can't hear how their voice sounds, that means they're stupid. This guy is researching for a cure, researching for a reason why there are so many deaf people that live here. Obviously, they don't know anything about genetics, and it just so happened that the people, probably this is what happened, that the people who settled on this island, there was a stronger predisposition towards deafness in their DNA. He also wants to get a live specimen. That's how he's thinking of these deaf people. As you could probably surmise by this book, Mary ends up being his live specimen, and she ends up being plunged into a world who is unwilling to make any accommodations for her. She can't understand anything that's going on. And because of it, and because of the way that she's treated, she can't ask for certain things. She doesn't know when certain things are going on. She's looked at as stupid, as an imbecile. I'm like, it's your fault, people, that she's having to suffer this way. When some of that started going on, trying to calm myself down, I was getting so angry, so viscerally involved. I have this sense of wanting justice. My mom had said it's very strong in both my sister and I. And I always get so angry when things like this happen. And I knew as soon as I started listening to these certain things that I'm just like, okay now, all right. And I know that there are now 3 books in this series. I don't know what else Lazat is going to talk about and the other ones, but I'm definitely going to get a hold of them. That I haven't put this through Compile yet. I have written the review, but I haven't finished all that part of it. But I know this is going to get 5 stars. This is very hard hitting. This is very eye-opening because there's also other things that Mary deals with in here, such as the hired hand that they have who is a freed slave, and he is married to an indigenous woman and they have a daughter. And then the way that people treat him, his daughter, the Native Americans who live in this area, this is chock full of emotional impact. The next book that I read is The Golem and the Jinni. And this book is absolutely fascinating. So I had put this on my book outlet wish list. It was available on there. And that's the one that I gave my dad for Christmas. And by the time he got around to purchasing it, it was no longer available on book outlet. Things go in and out of stock there a lot. But he went and purposely purchased this because he's already read this, loved it, and was like, you have to read this as well. And I see why he said that. So obviously you have a golem and you have a jinni, but there's so much more involved in this book. And it's set in 1899, mostly in New York. You have a few main perspectives. You have the golem, Hava. She was created for this rather interesting character who doesn't last long, to be his wife. There's interesting things there. He wakes her up on the boat over to America, but he has appendicitis, doesn't get it treated soon enough, and he dies. So now she is released and has to figure out what to do with her life and almost gets in trouble. But there is a rabbi in New York City who figures out what she is, takes her under his wing, and helps her survive. Another perspective that you have is of the jinni. So there's a metalsmith who is doing different repairs and things for people. That's his job. He's brought this thing for repair and is trying to fix it. And he rubs this flask and out pops the jinni, who is completely astounded to learn that over 1,000 years has passed since he was put into this flask. And also he has this iron cuff on his wrist, meaning he can't shift into different shapes. So you've got those are the 2 main perspectives. You also have flashbacks to a previous time where there's a girl, I think it's Fatwa is her name. Since I read this as an audiobook, I don't remember names anyway. But as you're reading those flashback sort of sections, you realize you're leading up until the point where the jinni gets put into the flask and trying to figure out that part of it. And there's a few other perspectives that come into the story. You have another guy who calls himself Ice Cream Sala. He used to be a doctor. Then there's this mysterious affliction, and you kind of realize that it was some sort of possession by an ifrit or something like that completely ruined his life. And he becomes a pivotal character, especially towards the end. There's another character who was the magician who made Hava. And he had immense skill, and he becomes incredibly entwined. And so the main perspectives are Hava, Ahmed, or the jinni, and Fatwa, then the flashbacks. But you also have other perspectives that weave in and out through this. And this was it was fascinating. It's a very slow, gradually unfolding plot. There's a lot of stuff that is discussed, that is debated. You try to figure out different aspects of the history and what's going on and how these different people are involved. It's not monumental possible world ending life. It's day-to-day immigrant stories and how they've been involved in these different mythologies coming together. You've got the Jewish with the golem, you've got Arab with the jinni, and it's absolutely fascinating. There are a couple other books. This is supposed to be a series, but I don't think I'm going to read those others because this stands really well on its own as a book. And I've heard that maybe not a couple others, maybe there's just one up there, but I've heard that one is not as good as this one. There are threads that are not brought to a conclusion by the end of this where you could see where more could be done, but you don't necessarily need that. I think I prefer it that way because life, it's not all wrapped up in a nice neat bow. Everything's taken care of. So I really enjoyed this book. I don't think it's going to make 5 stars quite. I think it's going to be a really, really high 4.5 stars, but this was an excellent book. Okay, Saturday night. I normally don't film updates this late, but I decided I'm going to go ahead and film this update. I don't usually include the books I read on Saturday. Anyway, if I have everything filmed, then I have no excuse to postpone editing of the vlog tomorrow morning. I have 3 books to talk about. 2 I do not have physical copies of. 1 I do plan to purchase, but I don't have it. And the other one I do have a copy of. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about that one, and that is the graphic novel Borders. This was on my 24 in 24 list. It fulfilled one of the prompts for Magical Readathon. Again, I don't remember what that is, and I seem to have misplaced the paper where I wrote down all of the books I was taking for these various classes, which is good job for me. Anyway, so the setup for this book, I think it's based on a true story, a true incident in history. There have been several tribes who, when borders were drawn, both the northern border between Canada and the US and the southern border between the US and Mexico, where their historic lands was literally divided by this line. And the arbitrary administration of this line means that to get from side to side to visit relatives, basically, and other parts of their homeland, they had to cross a national border, and that usually takes a lot of extra administrative work and etc. In this story, you have a single mom. She has 2 kids. One is 17 or 18 by the time of the story and has moved to Salt Lake City. The dad was American, so she has American birthright citizenship because of her dad. So she can easily cross the border. And then the son still lives with the mom. I think he's young, middle elementary, basically. And he misses his sister. He wants to go visit her. He doesn't pressure his mom, but he does ask a few times if they can go visit. And so they decide to go visit. And that means crossing the border, driving down. It shouldn't be an issue. This is before you had to have a passport card or a passport to cross the Canada-US border. And when they get to the border, they're asked a few questions that are like basic questions, and then they're asked about citizenship. The mom says Blackfoot. That's her citizenship. That's the nation that she belongs to. The people, the border agents, are super nice, and they're like, that's really cool that you're Blackfoot. I love that you're identifying with that, but are you American or Canadian? And she insists on Blackfoot, and so they turn her away. So she goes back to the Canadian border, because there's like this no man's land that's nebulous area in the middle. Again, that border agent, super nice, asks him again, and she sticks with Blackfoot. She can't let them through. They have to say US or Canadian. They have to say a recognized citizenship. And so for several days this goes on, and the mom is insisting on it, and they don't let her through, and they end up going to this duty-free store, which is a very small shop. They make friends, basically, or at least the son makes friends with the guy who's there. When he finds out what's going on, he gets in touch with the news media. And then because it becomes a story, then something starts to happen with this. Now, the book itself is fairly simplistic. I was expecting it to go a little bit more deeper than it did, but it still laid it out in pretty plain, simple, unmissable terms. It didn't go as deep as I would have wanted as maybe an adult reader, but I think this is very appropriate for a younger reader. I think this is very well done, and it highlights an aspect of history that can definitely be used to debate, to discuss these different issues. I could even probably use this in a high school class if I wanted to, if I were able to get my hands on class sets when we discuss political geography, talk about the drawing of the borders and how that affects peoples and nations versus states and etc. So this is a good book. Okay, so the other two books, one of them is an ARC that I finished, and the other is an audiobook that I have been on the waiting list for a while. That's the one that I'm definitely going to purchase a copy of. Okay, so the ARC is the widely unknown myth of Apple and Dorothy. I thought when I started reading it that it was a young adult book. But at one point, one of the characters mentions that she's only 12 years old. And it shook me. I'm like, wait a second, this is a middle grade book? So I went and I looked it up. It is a middle grade book. And I don't know if finding that out helped me put that into perspective and realize, oh, these are middle graders. But it definitely shifted my perspective a little bit. So in this story, it's not a Greek myth retelling, but it is firmly rooted in myths. So instead of having, like in Percy Jackson, demigods that go and interact with people and live regular lives, they live on this one particular hill. And every year at the solstice, they have to climb this ladder, pay homage to the gods, and then go back down. They are considered near gods. If they don't keep up their near godhood. They can do slight little godly type things, not huge things like the actual gods, like Zeus and Hera and etc. But this one year, Dorothy's mom decides not to climb the ladder, and it becomes a big issue. And also, a month later, because she's now mortal, she's hit by a car and she dies. And this completely uproots the entire community. Then you have Dorothy's friend, not a best friend, but their moms were supposedly best friends. The mom who died, and then Heather, I think is the name of Apple's mom. Heather is a descendant of Hera. For some reason, like Zeus and Hera, I think. And because of that, like the myth of Athena popping out of Zeus's brain on her own, somehow Heather's able to do that. So Apple doesn't have a dad. This decree comes down at the beginning of the story, basically, where you've got a month until the winter solstice, until you're supposed to climb the ladder again. You either climb the ladder and stay in Olympus, or you stay on Earth and you become mortal. It's an ultimatum. No more in between like they have been. Obviously, this throws things into tumult. Dorothy doesn't exactly know what she wants to do. Apple is following what her mother says. Her mother is very domineering. And Apple also talked to Dorothy's mom before she made the decision to stay behind. Oh no, after, in that month after. And Dorothy's mom made Apple promise, take care of my daughter, which, why are you putting that on a 12-year-old? I don't know. So Apple feels really obligated, and she is trying desperately to make Dorothy come with her when they make this decision. The book read very weird. The characters at first seemed a lot older than they were. Then once Apple says that thing in her narrative where she's only a 12-year-old, I'm like, oh, they're only middle schoolers? Then from that point on, they start to read like middle schoolers, and I don't know whether that was my perspective or not. It felt very weird. The decisions, what they were being asked to do, what Apple ended up doing, the consequences of that, how it played out, it wasn't bad. It just didn't make a lot of sense. So I didn't really vibe with this book. It's not bad. I just didn't get it. It takes a lot for anything related to Greek myths to pull me in. That's probably going to end up as a 3.5 stars. I haven't put it through Compile yet. I'm really falling behind on my goal to keep up with my reviews. I need to get better with that. I mean, I am better than I was towards the end of last year. That brings me to what is definitely a 5-star read. Definitely going to be high on my list of nonfiction reads for the year, and that is Oath and Honor by Liz Cheney. I knew this would be a hard-hitting book. And I will say right now, I fundamentally disagree with a lot of Liz Cheney's politics. And there were some interesting points in her narrative where she's talking about some of these views, not on issues specifically. It's hard to put into words, but she's talking about certain things, talking about certain people. And I'm like, oh, I don't really agree with you. That being said though, I have the utmost respect for Liz Cheney. She is the kind of person who has integrity in every sense of the word. What she believes, she sticks to. She is going to stick to it. She's going to tell the truth, and she is not going to back down. She's not going to be persuaded. She is not going to compromise her beliefs to save face, to save her political career. And that takes guts. She also is very intelligent. And in this book, she talks about a fairly short period of time. It's both memoir, but also a very striking condemnation of some of the things that have been done. And she talks about, I think it's from around the time of when the former president first started spreading his big lie. It goes through the insurrection. She talks about her time on the committee. She talks about losing her primary campaign. And she mentions some things towards the end that were happening at the end of 2023, which is when she was writing the book. So it's a very short window, about 3 years max. I knew some of the information. I knew a lot of the facts about this, but the way that she writes this book, it is incredibly compelling. It is incredibly saddening and infuriating as well, because there is an unfortunately, a tragically large group of people. Well, two groups of people. There's a group of people that are willing to compromise on just about everything for their own benefit. Kevin McCarthy. And then did it work out for him? No. That's another story. Then there's also another group of people who are so utterly deluded and have bought into the poison, have drunk the Kool-Aid, the literal Kool-Aid. You know, the Jim Jones, all the, cult. And it's scary to think of what might happen later this year. When Liz Cheney was talking about the events, the actual events of the insurrection, I was remembering that day when I was at work. And that year, my last 2 class periods were my planning periods. I remember going into the classroom of my content partner who had, I think, the BBC live coverage of what was going on the TV. Several of us gathered in that room. We could not believe what was happening. We were like, this, I think one of my colleagues said something about like, this is the death of democracy. We were absolutely dumbfounded at what we were watching. And yet people try to play that off as peaceful protest. And, oh, they were just visitors. When I go to a place, I don't try to beat people up, period, much less if I'm visiting a tourist site. I've been in the Capitol building before as a tourist. Highest of respect for where I was. It's an incredibly profound book. Very well needed. I also thought a lot about reading Midnight in Washington, which is written by Adam Schiff. Completely other side of the political spectrum, but also someone who very clearly laid out what happened. A larger time frame, but also included some of the same things that Liz Cheney talked about. You've got people on both sides of the spectrum who have strong integrity and are willing to stand by what they believe in. Whether or not you agree with them, look at what they're saying. Listen to the truth of what they're saying. It's sobering. This is definitely a 5-star read. It's interesting. My top 2 nonfiction for the year, we've got Oath and Honor, basically talking about the downfall of democracy, and we've got A Problem in Hell, talking about America's terrible response and lack of response to various genocides over the past 100 years. What does that say about my taste in history? I'm not really all that sure. I have read several really good books. I have not finished a book as of today. As of yesterday, Friday, I had read a book for every day. I'm on track for 30 and 30. I'm a little behind that right now because I haven't finished one today. But if I finish 2 tomorrow, which I plan to, I will be back on track. Not that shabby of a reading week. I am really looking forward to diving into even more really interesting reads. I have only 2 more required reads for April, and I'm also plugging away on ARCs. I'm getting a lot done on all of my goals. So thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.